I would just want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to do a really short introduction because we really want to have time for both the presentations and the Q&A afterwards. As you probably already know, this is part of our general plan series, and it's on housing discrimination and discriminatory housing practices. We will be treated by a presentation from resident John Kent on the history of racism in Culver City, and we will also have a presentation by Richard Rothstein, the author of The Color of Law. After that, we will have a panel with both John Richard and Kelly Lytle Hernandez, our MacArthur Genius fellow. I'm sure you're tired of that by now. But we'll jump into a few questions and then open it up to the audience. But in the interest of time, let's go with John right now.
Well, it would have made sense for this presentation to go second, because Richard's going to talk about the way law shaped segregation and discrimination on a national level. And when I'm going to talk about how some of that, how law shaped it in Culver City, but also a lot of practices in the city. And as we're looking towards formulating a new general plan, it's crucial that we're honest about our history and that we be clear about where we want to go. And I'm going to talk about, frankly, our ugly racist past, as well as lingering elements of that of our past continuing today. And I will argue that we still have the potential to become a national model of diversity and inclusion. And this picture that was taken of some of our public school students at a math Olympiad is what I think the potential is for this city, kind of symbolizes the possibilities. But to look at the history, Culver City was founded on land stolen from the native Tongva people. For centuries, the Tongva lived on land currently part of Culver City. One of their long-used footpaths became the 405 freeway. They were massacred by waves of Spanish, Mexican, and Euro-American invaders through a combination of slavery, disease, relocation, forced labor, imprisonment, broken treaties, and a genocidal war of extermination that included paid bounties for dead Indians. And here's a quote from our resident expert on a lot of the history of Los Angeles and the author of The City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles, which is an excellent book. I recommend it. And she says that by the end of the 1870s, in a region where an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 native people had lived, U.S. Census takers counted just 316 native persons. That amounts to a 97% population decline. And if you want to really get into this, I recommend this book, which is a hard read, Murder State. And it's not exaggerating. This is about the genocide of the native people in California. And to make it worse, when Culver City was founded, no native people were allowed to live here. As James Lowen revealed in his 2009 book, Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism, Culver City was a sundown town. And towns like Culver City earned this name because some of them posted signs at their city limits reading the N-word, "Don't let the sun go down on you." And here's another example of these signs. In Culver City, this restriction applied to non-white and Jewish people.
John, can you read that? Because people here can't see that little corner.
Oh, this sign here?
Yeah,
Whites only, within the city limits after dark.
thanks.
Now, many people know this, especially non-white people. When I first wrote this article that Daniel mentioned on the history of Culver City racism, which is available, by the way, if you want a copy of it on the back table. I have a few up here. It has all the citations, the documentation, if you want to see where I drew the information from. I got a lot of feedback and responses from people, including on social media and emails and a lot of different ways. And I'm going to cite some of that here because it shows how many people actually know about this history. Older black woman says, grew up in LA, everyone knew it. Driving to the beach, you drive around Culver City, you get stopped every time. A black man. It was clear to me in the 90s as a teenager that my city, that I was representing every Friday on the football field, would then turn its back on me, literally on the way home from the game. And I had to worry what streets we took if I didn't want to be harassed. It's not on the citizen to prove a racist city is still racist. The onus is on the city to prove it has effectively dealt with the cancer of white supremacy. And here's from a Jewish man. We were among the early Jewish settlers in Culver City. In the early 1950s, my dad and 11 other Jewish men decided that Culver City needed a synagogue. So they began what would become Temple Akiba. That did not go down well with the local burghers. And our house suffered a cross burning, not with flames, but with water softener salt burned artfully into our front lawn with Jews go home and a cross. A white woman. My dear 80-year-old Japanese friend said that they wanted to buy a house in Sunkist Park and they were told they couldn't because they were Japanese. Now, right at the very beginning, Harry Culver was promoting his city as a model little white city. Here's an ad from the Harry H. Culver Company, which ran in the Los Angeles Herald in 1915. And here's a close-up of what it said on the ad. See this model little white city, scarcely a year and a half old. And Harry Culver's close associate, a guy named Guy Rush, was even less subtle with his pre-Christmas ads, promising a present and a box of fine candy from Santa to every child who brought an adult with them. Only problem was, lots and presents restricted to the Caucasian race. This was in the Los Angeles Herald, 1913. And now the way they did this at the beginning was when Harry Culver announced his plans for the city in 1913, he had these racial attitudes in mind, and he stated that the initial tract will be subdivided into about 250 large residence lots, each with proper restrictions. And there were two key elements to this statement. First, his reference to large residential lots established an economic restriction. And this is a quote from Richard Rothstein, who will be here soon, I hope, from his Color of Law, which is also a really good book. I recommend it. It's about the way laws were established in the whole country that help segregate people. And what he points out is that large lot size was a common exclusionary zoning ordinance that was successful in keeping low-income African Americans, indeed all low-income families, out of middle-class neighborhoods. And the second element of his initial statement when he was founding the city was that they were establishing what are called deed and covenant restrictions on the properties he sold. And he became an expert in these restrictions. In 1927, when he was president of the Los Angeles Realty Board, he oversaw the issuing of this opinion. The Los Angeles Realty Board recommends that realtors should not sell property to other than Caucasian in territories occupied by them. Deed and covenant restrictions probably are the only way that the matter can be controlled. And this is a quote from another great book, City of Segregation. And these deed restrictions still exist today. Even though they're now illegal and enforceable, many of them are on residential property deeds in Culver City. And here's the wording on one house in Sherbourne Drive. That said premises shall not, nor shall any part thereof, ever be conveyed, transferred, leased, or demised to any person other than that of the white or Caucasian race. It's pretty explicit. And in fact, these deed restrictions were official Culver City policy. During World War II, Culver City convened a meeting of its air raid wardens at the council chambers at City Hall. The wardens were to canvass the city to ensure families kept their lights off at night or installed blackout curtains to avoid aerial attacks. The meeting, ironically, was held under a banner proclaiming "God bless America" and "Life, Liberty, and Justice for all." Mike Tellefson, the city attorney, came to this meeting and instructed the assembled wardens that when they went out door to door, they should circulate documents in which homeowners promised not to sell or rent to African Americans. And somebody that was at this meeting from the California Eagle wrote down this quote from him. "You cannot prevent an owner from selling property to a Negro, but such restrictions will prevent him from occupying." And we also had the honor of having the Ku Klux Klan in town. Now, in the mid-1920s, they claimed almost 5 million members in the United States, with California known as a strong Klan state. And prominent people in the film industry have testified to their extensive presence in Culver City. For example, George Stevens, who was a two-time Oscar-winning director for A Place in the Sun and Giant, has been quoted as saying, "In studios, most of the guys I knew were members of the Ku Klux Klan, and Culver City was just loaded with that particular thing." And Louis Millstown, who was also a two-time Oscar-winning director for All Quiet on the Western Front and Two Arabian Nights, he wrote, "The Ku Klux Klan got so strong in Culver City that you would drive to the studio, and in the middle of the road you'd see a white paint initials, 'Klansman, I greet you, Kiggy.'" And the Klan's presence in Culver City continued through the 1940s as a regular thing, quite large, including within the city's police force. And a cross burning occurred on a black family's lawn as recently as 1976. Now we'll start talking about the police, because over the years, the Culver City Police have played a significant role in maintaining the color lines in the city. In the 1940s, the chief of police was accused of misconduct, including openly recruiting for the Klan. And there's numerous historical reports from black entertainers and musicians who performed in Culver City. When they finished late at night, they would be either arrested or escorted by police officers back to the Central Avenue district in Los Angeles. And in 1950, the owner of the Roller Dome, which is a skating rink here in town, told a well-known black musician and his family, "We do not admit Negroes. Negroes are not allowed to skate here." The police were called and told the family to clear out of Culver City and never show their faces here again. Oh, and ironically, this is just worth noting, this Roller Dome, with the skating rink, does anybody know where what the site of that was, or that is what it's been turned into now in Culver City? Well, it's Tellefson Park. So we go from segregated Roller Dome to a park honoring a segregationist or white supremacist. In 1967, the Culver City Police Department hired its first black police officer, James Ford. According to a profile of Ford in the Los Angeles Sentinel, Ford discovered there was major racism within the department. He reported that his first years as a police officer were wrought with name-calling and challenges. And he said he experienced similar sentiments from Culver City residents. And I do have documentation of all that stuff too, if anybody wants it. The Culver City Police in 1994 hired Tim Wynn. And he was considered one of the most unemployable cops in the country because he had been seen by millions on videotape kicking and beating Rodney King. He was one of the cops that beat Rodney King. And the Culver City Police hired him. He had been fired by the Los Angeles Police Department. And despite more than 700 signatures on a petition to have Wynn fired, and emotional protests by a stream of residents, the City Council voted unanimously to endorse this hiring. This is 1994. In 1998, LA Weekly reported that the Culver City Police were hog-tying suspects' feet to their hands behind their back as a method of control. This is what that looks like. This is a hog tie. And they did it even after it had been banned in other police departments. And the LA County Coroner's Office had concluded that hog ties by Culver City Police led to the deaths of 2 suspects. They even declared them homicides. Coroner's Office. Those suspects were non-white. One of these cases was reviewed by a jury, which awarded $500,000 to the family of the murdered suspect. I assume that came from Culver City taxpayers' money. And no charges were ever filed against the police in either case. Declared murder or by homicides by the coroner's office and no charges. And now we're going to start talking about the present day, because all of that stuff is about 10 or 20, the most earliest is about 20 years old, but now we'll talk about more recent. And there's no question that our city has an ugly past, but it has also made great strides forward. For example, by some estimates, it has one of the most diverse student populations in the country. And that's why I showed that picture at the beginning, because we do have the potential to be a totally different city. However, there are still serious problems, which as we look to the future, we need to address. And this, from James Lowen, who's the author of the Sundown Downtown book I told you about, talks in his book about what he calls second-generation sundown town issues. He warns that within a city's workforce, among police officers, teachers, and city employees, there can be problems lingering from a white supremacist past. As our city updates its general plan, it will be essential that all those elements of the city's infrastructure be examined for these lingering problems. And with this in mind, I want to look more closely at the Culver City Police Department, because they've been one of the main ones perpetuating this stuff. Now again, to quote James Lowen, because he studied this a lot, some downtown police forces may still be viewed by themselves and other residents as the city's first line of defense against black interlopers. As a result, they engage in DWB, driving while black, policing, targeting black motorists for minor infractions like failing to signal turns. And just to illustrate this, one of the responses I got to my article was from a white woman who wrote, "I remember way back when people would not drive through Culver City because you would be pulled over for a broken taillight, amplified music, etc. It kept a chaotic element out of the city. I never had a problem with that. Culver City needs to continue that legacy. People need to know and be made aware that this city does not tolerate speedsters, gangsters, lawbreakers, drunk drivers, etc. This is not the city for them." And I would call this the classic example of using dog whistles or, coded language to make the message clear about what they're really talking about. And as Kelly has so powerfully demonstrated in her book, the Los Angeles area has become the national, maybe even the world leader in using intensified policing and mass incarceration as a means of controlling non-white populations. And frankly, Culver City is no exception to this pattern. Here's a headline on the May 11, 2018 edition of the NBC Local News. Los Angeles Police Department captain alleges he was victim of racial profiling by Culver City Police. This is just last year. The online article went on to say, Captain Darnell Davenport, who commands the LAPD's Southwest Patrol Division, took legal action last month after he said he was unjustly stopped and questioned by 2 Culver City officers under the 405 freeway. Mr. Davenport is an avid supporter of law enforcement. Thus, he has been particularly disturbed by his treatment, the claim document said. Mr. Davenport encourages and supports proactive policing methods. However, he cannot reconcile his detention with any justification other than the racial profiling of African American males, the claim said. And here's the headline, Eyewitness News, April 21st, 2018. Dash cam video shows Culver City officers use chokehold to subdue man. It referred to a February 4th, 2017 traffic stop and arrest of a black LA resident named Terry Walton, who was passing through Culver City. The city and several of its police officers were sued over the arrest and settled out of court for $200,000. And I'm going to read a quote from a local online publication called the Culver City Catalyst to highlight some of the coverage of this incident. And this article was written by Warren S.Z. And he says, from what can be gleaned in the dash footage, the police officer's chokehold goes on for at least 2 minutes. That's an extremely dangerous length of time to restrict oxygen flow to the brain. Muscle spasms in Mr. Walton's legs began triggering sporadically about 25 seconds into the hold as officers turned him onto his chest. Interspersed with random punches from a second police officer, the spasms go on for a minute before Mr. Walton is still, possibly unconscious. Brings to mind the slogan, I can't breathe. And then here, May 2013 headline in the Los Angeles Times. $8.8 million awarded to family of man killed by Culver City officer. And I'll just read a little bit from the article. This is excerpts. A jury Wednesday evening awarded $8.8 million to the family of a man fatally shot by the Culver City police officer. The unanimous verdict came in U.S. District Court after juries deliberated for a few hours, very short deliberation, over the 2010 death of Lee Joy Grisham. 4 officers and a supervisor responded with guns drawn. The officers ordered Grisham out of his car. Officer Luis Martinez fired 3 shots from a submachine gun. These are my emphasis, by the way, all of which struck Grisham. The other officers at the scene all testified that Grisham was facing the officers and had nothing in his hands when he was shot, the attorney said. Grisham was found to be unarmed. Lee Joy Grisham was black. And as always almost happens in these cases, a review by the district attorney determined the killing to be reasonable and lawful. But I've read the DA's review, and frankly, I agree with the jury. In the review, in addition to the part here where it talks about the other officers not seeing anything threatening or nothing in his hands, 2 civilian witnesses said Grisham had his hands in the air when he was shot. And then another thing it has buried deep in this review is that Officer Martinez was looking at Grisham through the target sights of his submachine gun. Now, I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I've done a lot of shooting of rifles and pistols. I've looked through a lot of sights, and I can tell you when you're looking through the sight of a gun, you have a very, very narrow view of what you're looking at. You do not see the big picture. You're just seeing a little bitty tiny bit of the target of what you're aiming at. To me, it's impossible to think that he would know enough to be able to kill somebody. But that's what they said in the review, and then they said it was reasonable and lawful. So was Officer Martinez ever disciplined or charged? I have not been able to find any record that he was. And in fact, in 2016, Martinez was the president of the Culver City Police Officers Association. In other words, 3 years after $8.8 million was awarded because he shot somebody, the Culver City Police elevated him to their official representative. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the evidence of the power of police in this city. And here we're going to talk about what the budget looks like. And I think all this stuff is very relevant to the general plan. The proposed budget for 2019-20 has the police department at $46.5 million. And the fire department is a little more than half of that. And then you can see everything else falls off. Community development way down at the bottom, Parks and Rec, Public Works, you know, they got much smaller parts of the budget. And in fact, over 1/3 of the total city budget goes to the police. And then even more interesting is the pay scales for the police. Here's what the police chief was paid. This is 2017, the last numbers I could get, total pay and benefits for. He makes over $500,000, was making 2 years ago, over $500,000. Police chief, the town's got 40,000 people. Assistant chief of police is over $400,000, close to $500,000. There's 4 policemen. This is the ranking of the on the Culver City pay chart of where they are. 4 of them are above in the top 10 of the paid positions in the city. The city manager's in there also, and the rest were fire, if I remember right. And then, just as a comparison, I put in the school. They're not paid by the city, so it's actually a different chart. But you can look at how much they're paid, and I put them in where they would fit if they were in the Culver City chart. The superintendent of the schools, in charge of all of our children's education, is way down the list compared with the chief of police. The high school principal, even further down, would be 180, 166. Elementary school, 188. I'll come back to this police officer in a second. And then a council member, the people we elect to represent us and to be in charge of this city, are in the 600s, $28,000 for one. And school board members almost disappear off the bottom of the chart, in the 800s on the list, 800. So this is, $3,000 to $6,000 we're paying the people that are in charge of all the schools in Culver City. And to go back to the superintendent of schools, there are 17 police officers in Culver City making than the school superintendent. So it kind of shows you what the priorities are. And just as another way of looking at it, the average salary for a chief of police in California is $309,000. And this by itself is 44% above the national average. So the California police are getting paid a lot more.
John, it was 139.
Oh, did I just say it? Yeah, $139,000.
They paid them a lot more.
Sorry.
Microphone.
Anyway, they $139,000, and that's higher than the national average by quite a bit. And yet, the Culver City chief of police is getting almost 4 times that much. And again, we're a small town. Oops. It's a little too fast. And just to look at, the reason I put this police officer in here is to show you that there are 94 police officers in Culver City making more than the average California chief of police. I'm being told I'm not close enough to the mic. Yes. To repeat that, there are 94 police officers in Culver City making more than the average chief of police in California. That's kind of eye-opening.
Can I ask, because this is pay and benefits, the superintendent and all the others that you're comparing to is also pay and benefits?
Yes, that's my understanding, yes.
And the national one is pay and benefits?
Well, that I need to double check.
It's
Yes.
probably not.
Yeah,
Just,
you might be right. It's still quite informative. All right, now now we're going to start looking at racial demographics of arrests. And I'm just going to throw this out to the audience. If anybody wanted to guess what the ratio of non-white to white arrests in Culver City over a 2-year period was, would anybody want to volunteer a number? Like 50-50, 60-40,
75%.
85%? 50-50?
No, 85-15.
Oh, 85-15 for arrests of non-white. Pretty close. Anybody else?
75% non-white.
Well, I'll show you what it is. 80% non-white. And here is the actual breakdown. 37% of the people arrested in Culver City over a 2-year period were black. 35% Hispanic, 20% white, and 8% other. And Culver City is about 8% black. And the west side is about 5% black, west side of LA. LA County is about 8% black. So this number is just like way out of whack. 2 minutes? I'll try. Anyway, 37% is way out of whack. The Culver City Police seem to have something for black people. So now I want to talk about, those are just the facts. That's just the way it is. That's what's been going on. Now I want to talk about what people think about it. In other words, how they feel. And here's some more responses that I got to my article. This is a black man. As a teen in the 90s, and Culver City High School former student, I experienced firsthand on numerous occasions running that gauntlet down Washington Boulevard. Me and my friends always took Venice Boulevard to go home after the constant harassment. None of us gangbanged or were troublemakers. Just being brown or black in Culver City would get you a regular stop. Even to this day, Culver City PD still has a long way to go, in my humble opinion. A Latina, I have lived in Culver City my whole life. They have always racial profile. Maybe some officers don't, but there are plenty that do. You don't have to behave like anything. You just have to have a look, and that's enough for some to go and pick on you. I can say it has gotten a little better, but racism is everywhere, unfortunately. You know us brown people can't have a nice, new, expensive cars unless we're doing something wrong to get it. Older black women, don't be shocked, be better. There's still so much that is still the same in CC. Getting stopped for walking, driving while black in CC is still happening. Black woman, that's still a city you don't want to ride through after dark. Black woman, Mar Vista, Culver City is amazing. Latina, 5 Culver City cops beat my father inside our garage, claiming they had followed him from Palms. I'm going to speed this up. You can get the point. But this slide I want to talk about, because this just was on social media within the last month. Remember when the woman in Fort Worth was shot, the black woman shot in her own house by a cop outside the house, shot through the window and killed her? It elicited discussion on social media in our city where people were literally saying they are terrified. Now I want to read this from a black woman. I have soon to be a 14-year-old that I'm allowing to start navigate and explore Culver City with his friends, and I am terrified that he might look suspicious to someone when the police are called and he is killed. Please do not respond with, as long as he's not doing anything wrong, he'll be okay. Or teach him to be respectful to police and there won't be a problem. Because it is clear now that black people can be in their own homes and that does not shield them from dying from a cop's bullet. So only imagine what might happen on a public street. And then she got responses that are, it's hard to read. They're tearful. It's just, I dropped my son off at a school and pulled over on a residential street because I needed to take a call. Police pulled up 4 minutes later saying they got a call. So I can't sit in my car on a residential street and have a phone conversation? It's sickening. And so many are fed up with it. Black woman. I myself have been harassed by CCPD, just not killed. Harassment is also not okay. White woman. My cousin was thinking of becoming a police officer. He did a ride-along with some officers in Culver City. The racism he heard from the cops during the ride-along was enough to turn him off from applying. So there's somebody that wanted to be a cop. White woman. There's nothing a black person can do to feel safe from the police, even sitting in your own home playing video games. Just one more. All right. I will skip this last one, but you get the point, I think. We have a problem. So, based on this is a statement from Jim Lowen, and he's been studying, again, the stuff about sundown towns. In his second edition, he says, most former sundown towns have never admitted their racism. And because of this, our city has a chance to set a national example. To do this, I propose that Culver City publicly and officially do the following as soon as possible. Admit it, apologize, renounce this past and commit to preventing it from happening, take concrete steps to rectify and address this history. And to this end, I'm going to be submitting to our City Council a draft resolution of acknowledgement, apology, and commitment to do better. I have some copies of this proposal here, and you're welcome to take them home and look at it. There's a lot to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, and we'll hear more from you during the Q&A. Now I'd like to invite Richard Rothstein up to do his presentation, the author of The Color of Law. Richard?
Thank you very much. And I apologize for being late. I misunderstood where the event was, and I apologize. I'm going to talk to you in your role as citizens, as John did, and remind you, let me begin by reminding you that in the 20th century we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools. Civil rights lawyers figured that if judges couldn't understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then that precedent was used to challenge racial segregation in colleges and universities. And then it led to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 that you're all familiar with, that prohibited legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown decision led to a movement of activism, of marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience, and people lost their lives in that struggle. It wasn't easy to desegregate things like lunch counters and buses, voting rights, employment. It wasn't easy. But yet, having done all those things, having desegregated public accommodations and transportation and schools, the civil rights movement at the end of the 1960s ended. And it left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. Every one. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were mostly white, all white, clearly defined areas that were mostly black or all black. Most of the country had come to understand in the 1960s that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful to both blacks and whites, not just to blacks, but to both blacks and whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. How could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area is residentially segregated? We're an apartheid society. We should confront it. We're an apartheid society. Partly it's because it's hard to undo. We abolish segregation in lunch counters or water fountains. The next day, you can sit at any lunch counter or drink from any water fountain. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, things would look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, I include myself, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, blacks and whites, is we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse that we give ourselves for failing to redress the segregation that we created, that our society created. And that excuse goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregations of schools and colleges and lunch counters and water fountains, that was all done by government. It was done because of laws and regulations and public policies, ordinances. As such, they were all civil rights violations. If the federal government was ordering that kind of segregation, it violated the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. If state and local governments were doing it, it violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. If we take our responsibilities as citizens seriously, we understand that if there's a civil rights violation, we have to remedy it. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that was something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That was just sort of happened by accident. It happened because bigoted white homeowners refused to sell homes to blacks in white neighborhoods, or landlords refused to rent to them, or maybe private businesses like banks or real estate agencies discriminated in how they carried out their jobs. Or maybe it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race. They feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because of income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and therefore many of them can't afford to live in middle-class neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, bigoted, but not governmental decisions are what's created neighborhood segregation. And what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We give a name to this rationalization. We call it de facto segregation, a term that you're all familiar with and we all use. And we think it's entirely different from legally created segregation, and the Supreme Court has adopted that view. I began the research that led to my book when I saw a Supreme Court decision in 2007 that prohibited the school districts of Louisville and Seattle from implementing a very, very token desegregation plan. Both school districts had a choice plan where parents could choose which school their child would go to. But if the choice was going to further intensify segregation, it wouldn't be on in favor of a choice that wouldn't. So if you had an all-white school or a mostly white school, there was one place left, and both a black and a white child applied for it, the black child would be given some preference because that child would help diversify the school. It was a trivial program. You can't imagine a more trivial program. How often do you have one place left in the school and both a black and white child apply for it? Well, the Supreme Court denounced the program, prohibited it. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Chief Justice said that it's true the schools of Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Indeed, it's not just Louisville and Seattle. Schools are more segregated in this country today than they have been at any time in the last 50 years in this country. Any time in the last 50 years. But he said the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto, for all the reasons I just gave: private bigotry, actions of the private economy, self-choice, income differences. And he said, if you have de facto segregation that wasn't created by government, government is prohibited from doing anything to undo it. Well, I read that decision. It took place in Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, and I remembered reading a case in Louisville, Kentucky, where a white homeowner in a single-family home suburb of Louisville, something like Culver City, it was called Shively, had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville, renting an apartment. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, a good job, wanted to move to the suburbs, but no one would sell him a home. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in the suburb and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police wouldn't stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home, and the police didn't stop it. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home to a black family in a white neighborhood. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the courts are being used to enforce racial boundaries. And when I looked into it further, I found that there were thousands, I'm not exaggerating, thousands of cases of violence, frequently police protected, to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods in the 20th century. Every one of them is a civil rights violation. Every one of them, if we take our responsibilities as citizens seriously, require remediation, and yet we've never remediated it. And then when I looked into it further, I found that it wasn't just state-sponsored violence to maintain racial boundaries, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies that were designed to create, sustain, reinforce, and perpetuate racial segregation in this country. The notion of de facto segregation is another myth. There's no reality to it whatsoever. Of course, there was private bigotry involved. But without the actions of federal, state, and local governments to reinforce that private bigotry, to structure it, to require it, we wouldn't have the segregation that we have known today, and we wouldn't have the consequences of the segregation we know today, which include an enormous achievement gap between black and white students, simply because so many black students live in neighborhoods with severe social and economic disadvantages, that they can't possibly come to school as ready to learn as children who live in secure homes and in healthy neighborhoods. A consequence of the racial segregation is enormous health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, in large part because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods. One consequence is mass incarceration, with which we're all familiar. Couldn't happen if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods, where they don't have to be sought out. They're all right there, ready for the picking. And it also, a consequence of this racial segregation that we've created is the very dangerous and frightening political polarization that we have in this country today. Because how can we ever expect to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to understand each other's life experiences or empathize with each other. So those are the consequences of residential segregation that were created. So let me describe some of the major, very briefly, some of the major federal policies, as well as one here in Culver City, that created the residential boundaries that we know today, this apartheid system. The first I'll talk about briefly is federal housing. The first public housing in this country was not built for poor people. It was built during the Roosevelt administration, the New Deal, during the Depression. We had 25% unemployment rate in the Depression. Public housing was for the 75% who had good jobs, who could pay rent. It wasn't a subsidized program. They could pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. Public housing was the most desirable housing available. The reason public housing was necessary was because working families could afford housing, but there was no housing being built in the Depression. There was a housing shortage. And everywhere the federal government built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for blacks and whites, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. That may surprise you, but in the 20th century, we had a lot more integrated neighborhoods than we have today. We would be stunned if we were transported back to that time to see the extent of integration. For the simple reason that we were a manufacturing economy in those days. None of this internet stuff. Factories had to be located in a central district, near a railroad terminal, near a deep water port to get their parts and ship their final products. This was, you had a factory district which employed both African American and white workers. They all had to live roughly in the same neighborhood, so they could walk to work or maybe take short streetcar rides. We had streetcars in those days. These were integrated neighborhoods. The Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency, segregated those neighborhoods. For example, here on the West Coast, during World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production. Here on the West Coast, primarily aircraft manufacturing and shipyards, taking jobs that weren't available in the Depression. They overwhelmed the communities where these factories are located. Here on the West Coast, there were very few African Americans living before World War II. The big mass migration of African Americans to this region of the country came during World War II to take jobs in war industries. If the government wanted the ships and the tanks and the aircraft carriers and the jeeps to be produced, it had to create housing for those workers, and it did. Everywhere it created segregated housing. Separate housing for blacks and whites, even for workers who were working in the same war plants, but separate housing. Here in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles area, the government decided to place all housing for black workers in an area that was not previously black called Watts. It did want to place a housing project near the Santa Monica, what's now the Santa Monica Airport, where there was a Douglas aircraft factory. Local residents, white residents, objected. So the federal government moved it to Watts, deciding that that would be the black neighborhood of Los Angeles. And it succeeded in creating that segregation. In San Francisco, the government built 5 public projects for war workers. 4 of them were for whites only. 1 for African Americans in a neighborhood that the government decided was going to be a black neighborhood, now known as the Fillmore District, the Western Addition. And in Seattle and in Portland as well, up and down the West Coast, the segregation that we know today was created for the first time by federal government policy. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage. President Truman proposed to vastly expand the National Public Housing Program. Remember, not for poor people. These were for returning war veterans. Millions of returning war veterans who are coming home needing housing because we had a big housing shortage, much like we have today. President Truman tried to address it by building, again, the most desirable housing available, public housing. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's plan. Not because they didn't like poor people. Public housing wasn't for poor people. Not for racial reasons. It was always segregated. They were comfortable with that. They wanted to defeat it because they thought that public housing was socialistic. And the private sector should be building housing for war workers, returning war veterans. The private sector wasn't doing it, just like the private sector isn't creating housing for working and middle-class families today. But they wanted to defeat it, so they came up with a strategy, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail with this, but I won't take too much time. They came up with a strategy that we know is a poison pill strategy. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that term. Some are nodding their heads. A poison pill strategy is something that opponents of a bill do to try to prevent the bill from being passed, they propose an amendment, which we call a poison pill amendment, to the bill. They think that amendment can get a majority. And when the amendment is passed and attached to the bill, and the full bill comes up on the floor of the House and the Senate, a different majority finds the bill objectionable because of that poison pill amendment. So conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment as follows. From now on, all public housing has to be done on a non-racially discriminatory basis. No more of this segregation in public housing. Of course, it was a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all, but they figured they'd vote for that. They could get a few Northern liberals, they didn't need many, to vote for it as well. That would create a majority. And then when the full bill came up on the floor of the House and the Senate, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats, who were all in favor of segregated public housing, but not non-discriminatory public housing, and the bill would go down to defeat. So liberals had a difficult decision to make, the same kind of difficult decision that we have today, facing the same kind of enormous housing crisis. Were they going to support the non-discrimination amendment and resulting in no housing being built, or were they going to oppose the non-discrimination amendment and ensure that the housing would be built, that they would solve the housing crisis? Well, the leading liberal in the Senate was Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois. He was joined by his closest colleague, Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota. They decided to campaign against the non-discrimination amendment in order to save public housing. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate, made a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the non-discrimination amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the non-discrimination amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, he persuaded them. The non-discrimination amendment was defeated, and the federal government used that defeat in Congress as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs, not just public housing, until 1962. That's, you ask me, that's not so long ago. Very soon after this bill was passed, we had a vast expansion of public housing in this country. Again, for working families, not poor people, most desirable housing available. But very soon thereafter, something happened that was quite surprising. All the white projects developed large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects had long waiting lists. Soon, even the most bigoted public housing official, whether here in Los Angeles or elsewhere in the country, could no longer justify a situation where some of his projects were half empty and others had long waiting lists. So all the projects were opened up to African Americans. Public housing became a predominantly African American institution. At the same time, the industry that I talked about before left the cities because the highways were now being built. They could get their parts and ship their final products by truck. They no longer needed to be located in deep water ports and railroad terminals. Once that happened, good jobs disappeared from public housing residents as well as from other residents of urban areas. They became poorer and poorer. The government had to subsidize public housing for the first time. People could no longer afford to pay the rent. Once they did that, they stopped investing in it, stopped maintaining it. The projects deteriorated, and we got the kind of urban slums that we associate with public housing today. But that's not how it started. The question is, why did all the white projects develop all these vacancies? Why did the black projects have long waiting lists? And that's because of another federal program that was even more powerful in creating segregation in this country, here in Culver City and throughout the Los Angeles area and throughout the country. And that was a program by the Federal Housing Administration, a federal agency, that was explicitly designed on a racially explicit basis to move white working class families out of urban areas into single family homes in suburbs like this. The developers of these suburbs, you know them well, Lakewood, near the McDonnell Douglas plant, Federal Housing Administration project, Panorama City, north of Los Angeles, Westminster, that you're all familiar with. Westchester, is it called? Here, Westminster? West something, just outside Los Angeles, built by Henry J. Kaiser. All of these were FHA, Federal Housing Administration projects. The biggest one, of course, you've probably heard of it, east of New York City, was Levittown. East of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend to Levitt, or to Mark Taper, or to Henry J. Kaiser, or to any of these other developers, the money to build these enormous subdivisions of single-family homes, for which they had no buyers. We weren't a suburban country at that time in the mid-20th century. Nobody thought anybody would want to move to these suburbs. No bank would be crazy enough to make those loans. The only way these developers could build these projects in Culver City, outside Los Angeles, Levittown, south of San Francisco, east of San Francisco, throughout the country, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the developments. Those plans had to include an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required these developers to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And I'm sure that if any of you live in homes that were single-family homes in Culver City that were built in the mid-20th century or before, you still have those clauses in your deed saying that your homes are for Caucasians only. Once something's in the deed, it can't be removed. Well, this was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written in the Federal Policy Housing Manual. The manual said that no proposals for subdivision development could be approved if it was going to house African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that you could not approve a proposal for bank guarantees for a developer's loan if it was an all-white development located near where African Americans were living. Because, in the words of the manual, I'm quoting, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the Federal Policy Manual said. Where did this de facto notion come from? It's utter nonsense. It's utter nonsense. Here in Culver City, and I write this about this in my book, the city attorney of Culver City during World War II convened a meeting of all the air raid wardens. Air raid wardens during World War II, most of you too young to remember that, but their job was to go door to door and tell people to close their blackout curtains and turn down their lights so not to give guidance to Japanese bombers. The same thing was done on the East Coast to prevent German bombers from finding targets. My father was an air raid warden. He came home. I remember the hat he was wearing, the helmet was really cool. I thought that was a neat thing. The city attorney of Culver City convened a meeting of all the air raid wardens and told them that when they went door to door to get people to turn down their lights and close their blackout curtains, they should also make sure that every homeowner was up to date on its restrictive covenant, preventing any sales to non-Caucasians. This was the city of Culver City. What was the consequence of this? Well, the consequence of this was in the 1940s and early 1950s when these subdivisions were created, suburbs were created. The homes were relatively inexpensive. Like I say, many for returning war veterans. They had jobs in the post-war economy, industrial jobs mostly. Levittown, for example, sold for $8,000 a piece, those homes, 750 square feet. Here in this part of the country, they sold for slightly more, about $9,000 a piece. That's roughly about $100,000 in today's money. I guess you can still buy a house for $100,000 in Culver City, can't you? Yeah. What sells for? Well, I don't know what are they, $500,000, $600,000, maybe more? More? Right. All right. Or let's say on average maybe $800,000. These are 100,000 homes that are now selling for $800,000 in common currency values. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government with FHA and VA loans to buy these homes gained over the next few generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes, of your homes, $700,000. They used that wealth to send their children to college, to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, temporary unemployment, or maybe health issues. They used it to finance more comfortable retirements than they otherwise would have had. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who were prohibited from living in communities like this and others all across the country gained none of that wealth. They continued living in rented apartments, either in public housing or in private market in urban areas. Today, the result of that is African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. You would think that if people have similar incomes, they have similar wealth. Everybody can save the same amount from the same dollar. But the reality is that African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous gap between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional policies pursued by the federal and local governments to prevent African Americans from participating in the big growth of the middle class that took place in the mid-20th century. The remedies to take care of this are well known. Everybody knows what we need to do. We have lots of think tanks developing housing policies all over the place. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's willing to engage in the kind of direct action that forced change in the 1960s, because think tanks alone can't make this change. Proposals by federal governments, by federal candidates can't make this change. It's only can come as a result of the civil rights movement. If there was a civil rights movement here in Culver City, what would it demand? Well, how do you remedy what that city attorney did during World War II? Well, there's an easy remedy, a constitutionally required remedy actually for anybody who would put this kind of history before a court. What the city of Culver City should do to make amends for that is buy up homes as they come for sale at market rates, I don't know, $700,000, $800,000, and sell them to qualified African-American working-class families for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted... Get the streets and demand it. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very, very specific constitutional violation. And I've made a presentation like this to the American Bar Association, to lawyers groups all over the country. Nobody's ever said this would be completely constitutionally justified, even required by any court that had fidelity to the Constitution. So the remedies are well known. We are, for example, in this state and throughout the country, building affordable housing for low-income families, disproportionately minority. We're making the same choice that Senator Douglas and Hubert Humphrey made in 1949. We're building it where it's easiest to build, where we don't have to challenge segregation. We're building low-income housing in primarily low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation, and contributing to the achievement gap in schools and the health disparities and the mass incarceration and the wealth gap and the very dangerous political polarization we have. That is backwards. We will be placing a disproportionate amount, not all, but a disproportionate amount of low-income housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods, diversifying those neighborhoods. But neighborhoods like here, those here, put up such enormous opposition that developers don't want to go to the trouble of building housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods. They would rather build it in existing low-income segregated places, reinforcing their segregation. Well, that's the same thing that we did in the mid-20th century. So the solutions are well known. I can go into policy after policy after policy we know about, whether it's rent control or limits on condominium conversions and in gentrifying neighborhoods. Abolition of zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of anything but single-family homes on small lot sizes, on large lot sizes rather. The policies are well known. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that will take action, direct action, to demand such change, that will educate friends and neighbors and fellow churchgoers about this history and the requirement that we have as citizens to remedy it. And until we have that, I'm afraid that we are going down a very dangerous path that threatens our very existence as a democratic society. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard. Even though you ended a little downbeat, that was very inspiring. I'd like to invite Kelly Lytle Hernandez, the director of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA, to join us on the panel. I'm going to ask a few quick questions. And start with Kelly, since she's just joining the conversation, and then we'll actually open it up to the audience.
Before we get started, I just wanted to say one housekeeping note. Richard has a flight tonight, so he's going to be stepping away from the panel at 7:30. He'll be signing books in the back from 7:30 to 7:15, but we can keep the discussion going beyond that. 7:30 to 7:45, sorry.
Okay, so let's jump right into it. So we have time for a robust conversation. I wanted to start with you, Kelly, to see if you had any thoughts on how government-sanctioned housing discrimination affects other government institutions. I know with your $1 Million Hoods project, you do a lot of work on how in under-resourced neighborhoods, there are actually a lot of governmental resources being spent, but they're often spent to criminalize and harass poor Black and brown people. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts in the context of how housing discrimination itself, that's supported by government policy, can also lead to other deleterious effects on other government institutions and the way those institutions interact with people of color.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to see such a large and crowded room of neighbors and that we're all engaged in this struggle together. And I'm going to see you at the front lines. I had no idea. We're going to light it up with the new civil rights movement. I'm really excited. And John, thank you for your work. It's truly revelatory what you're doing. And you pulled a fire alarm in here and set it off and said, we need to get busy here in Culver City. So thank you to you. I think before I begin, I want to say a couple of things picking up on where John left off in terms of my own experience as a resident of Culver City. So for example, I'm the mother of 2 boys, and I always knew that as they came close to teenagehood, being mixed Black and Mexican, they were in trouble here in Los Angeles, that they would become, on the sights of the local police. And I chose Culver City, not wanting to be in Los Angeles and be with the LAPD. But 2 years ago, when my oldest son turned 14, he was going to his internship here in Culver City, and he jaywalked. A police officer pulled him over and asked him the very first question. Can you guess it? Where do you live? That's the second question. Are you on probation or parole? 14 years old. That was his first question. Light-skinned boy, middle-class boy. Imagine what's happening to our dark-skinned, working-class brothers and sisters. The questions then continued. Do you live in this neighborhood? Where are you from? It's a total gang member question, right? So that was my oldest boy. Before that, I was driving around the Tilden area, Tilden, Washington Boulevard, and I overheard some yelling. And I looked, and we saw that it was the Culver City Police Department had a Black man, a motorist, pulled over. And the very first question they had asked him was, are you on probation or parole? He got very angry, and he started yelling. And he had a screwdriver in his hands. He had stopped to be able to fix his car. And so we pulled over to film what was going on and to intervene on his behalf. And I submitted a complaint, which the police department did not respond to until Megan got involved. And then the complaint was basically dismissed. And what had happened was they saw a Black motorist, didn't look like he belonged in the neighborhood. They stopped him, or they drove up to him and asked if he was on probation or parole. I don't know whether he was or not, but that's an incredibly offensive question. Deeply racialized question. It's an opportunity to dismiss your Fourth Amendment rights in terms of protection against unreasonable search and seizure. So he was angry. He responded, I think, as many humans would do, and he was in deep danger. I also want to note that when I showed up is when the police officers turned on their cameras. They did not turn on their cameras when they were just having the altercation with this man. If something were to happen when no witness was there, it would not have been recorded. If the police officer said it was a hostile environment once I showed up, not their interaction with this man. So that's Culver City Police Department, picking up on where you left us. So Dan had asked about a project I lead. I lead $1 Million Hoods, which maps the fiscal and the human costs of mass incarceration here in Los Angeles, showing which communities where we spend more than $1 million per year locking up local residents in the local jail system. There are, 32 communities here in LA when we spend more than $1 million per year locking up local residents. Just in local jails, not state prison, not youth camps, not federal prison. And so some of those communities were not just spending $1 million per year, not 2, not 3, not 4, but tens of millions of dollars per year, per neighborhood, to send people to the local jail. Can you guess the top 2 charges in those neighborhoods?
Resisting arrest.
Loitering.
It's there. DUI and drug possession. So you have phenomenal investments that are put into mental health conditions, really. And mental health conditions that become most seen when people live on the streets, when they live in public, when you're poorly housed and poorly employed, and you live in public, and you act out of turn outside rather than inside, you're far more vulnerable to this kind of policing. So in our $1 Million Hoods, we have people who are struggling with mental health conditions, with housing precarity, who are being serviced by millions of dollars of public dollars, taxpayer dollars, to have them locked up rather than given the services that they need, which is largely counseling, housing, employment, education. That list you gave us about who's getting paid most, we need more teachers, we need more park workers, and we need those to be well-paid positions. So it's a matter of will, not of what we've got. We've got the money, we're showing this across the county of Los Angeles, and I certainly am imploring our elected representatives here tonight to think very carefully about the priorities we have in our local spending and our local budgets. And we can change this at the community level and work up to the county and to the state. So mass incarceration is part of the story of housing precarity.
Thank you, Kelly. I just have a few questions before we open it up to the audience. I feel like everyone tonight has spoken about some of the intentional ways that government on the federal, state, and local level has implemented housing segregation. And Richard, I think you hit upon some of the ways that we, I guess, unintentionally / intentionally do it through single-family zoning. I'm wondering if you have, or anyone on the panel has, other opinions or examples of unintentional ways that government, through policy, reinforces housing segregation, and maybe some alternatives that we could do. And I'm thinking very specifically in the context of something like SB 50, whose intent is to increase housing production across California, near transit, which in general sounds like a good thing. We need a whole lot of houses. But the rate of the housing is sort of based on a median income for a county. And for a county like Los Angeles, that's incredibly inadequate. Because if you take the median income in Culver City, and then you take the median income like in Athens and South LA, they're completely different. In Culver City, it could be anywhere from $80,000 to $100,000. In Athens, it might be $20,000. So if you're taking a median income that's based on a county level, and you're saying whatever housing that's built or transit has to be accessible to the median income, you effectively displace people in Athens. So I'm curious if you have any other ideas around housing policies that aren't explicitly discriminatory, but result in discrimination that we should look to address as a city.
Well, I don't have any short-term gimmicks for you. The reality is that the private sector is incapable of building housing that's affordable, not just for low-income families, but for even working-class and middle-class families. It's the SB 50, which will upzone a lot of areas around transit stops, and will not accomplish much in the way of desegregation. It will, the driver between SB 50, and I think it's a great bill, but the driver behind it is tech workers and professionals who can't afford housing in the communities where they work. There's nothing about increasing density on its own that's going to create racial desegregation. We need to be as explicit racially to correct this problem as we were to create it. And we can't rely on the private sector to do it. We need mixed income, mixed race, public housing that is the best housing available as it was prior to 1950, when it became a place to concentrate poor people.
Would anyone else on the panel like to comment? Okay, then I want to jump into other suggestions, though. Richard, I'm curious what you think around SB 50, if there were more strict affordable housing requirements added to the bill, if that might help to some degree address some of the social issues around class and race.
Well, you can't require affordable housing without paying for it. And unless there's much, much more investment in affordable housing, and I don't mean just poor people's housing. The term affordable is a very misused word. We need housing that's affordable for working class and lower middle class families. And the private sector can't do it. You can have upzoning around transit stops and you'll get a lot of condominiums built that will not be affordable, not just to poor people, but to working families. And there are many, many African American working families who are concentrated in segregated neighborhoods as a result of the policies I've described that need very racially targeted investments to help them to move out of such neighborhoods. But simply upzoning won't do it. It's a step in the right direction, but it alone won't do it.
So towards the end of your presentation, John, you talked about, and I feel like we were running low on time, but you talked about the steps that cities that were formerly sundown towns could do to address their history in terms of symbolic steps and then also policy. Could you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, what I said was that we need to do something that most sundown towns have not done yet. There's two that I know of in the Midwest that have admitted it and taken some steps to correct it. No sundown towns in the West have done this yet. And I think Culver City needs to take a step forward, be really bold, and admit it. We were a sundown town. We racially discriminated. We were a white supremacist town. Acknowledge, apologize for this. Take steps to remediate it. And I was starting to point to some in the police department. That is the first one I've really looked at deeply. In other words, this is a complicated process. So it's clear the police department is way out of whack from this past. In other words, it's because of that white supremacist history, that what they've been used for and what they've seen their job as and what the population has seen their job as, that we've ended up with a bloated, highly paid police force that really is robbing stuff from everybody else and is enforcing segregation and enforcing fear. I mean, that stuff on the social media that I read and the people talk to me about the experiences they have, it's heartbreaking. In other words, this is the way it impacts. I mean, look what Kelly's stories were like. This is what people experience in this city, and it has to change. And so this draft resolution, I think, is just a beginning. It's like our city council passing a resolution that says, we did this, here's all the bad things it led to, and here's what we're going to start doing to change it. I mean, just one item that I talk about in here is the official history of this city is so distorted. It has none of this stuff in it. Happy Mayberry is how it comes across. And that's not what we were or are, frankly.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I also want to lift up the significance of truth-telling, absolutely, but of reparations. And that's what you were getting at, I believe, in terms of needing to understand the harm that has been done through HOLC and FHA and federally subsidized segregation. That we can't just push a reset button and move forward. That the inequities of wealth that have accumulated over time will have enduring impacts that need to be addressed. So there's multiple ways that we can do that. I would also say that those reparations need to happen around housing. Of course, housing is real estate is land, and you opened us up talking about this being occupied territory, unceded territory. So if we want to think about a resolution about how this land has been inequitably distributed, taken and distributed. I don't know if there's something in there about
There is.
total revenue. Yes, nice.
Yes.
Very, very good. The related issue of mass incarceration that he's spoken about also has to be addressed in terms of reparations. If you talk about 4 to 5 generations of communities that have been impacted by fines and by fees, by the money bail system, by asset forfeiture, by the loss of life at the hands of law enforcement, which takes the breadwinner out of the family and then kind of ripples throughout the generations. You don't have a caretaker to stay home for the elders anymore. You no longer have a parent who can pay for the children to get their trombone lessons, to pay the rent, all that kind of stuff. There's a massive toll to mass incarceration that must also be repaired. So as we talk about truth-telling, I also want to make sure that we're holding on to that we must be heading toward a point of reparations. Otherwise, we're just making ourselves feel better. Right? We've got to start moving in a new direction.
I'd like to express a word of caution, though, about the term reparations. Most people hear the term reparations and they think of a single monetary payment to the current generation. And that is not going to solve this problem. We need ongoing policies, some of which will cost a lot of money, some of which were free. And that, of course, technically is what reparations mean, but most people don't understand it that way. And to lead people to think that we can solve it with a single monetary payment to the current generation is very dangerous, because once we've done that, if we did it, people would say, well, we fixed it now. Now it's blacks' problem. Now they have to fix it themselves. And it's going to take many generations, several generations to fix it. It's going to take some expensive policies, which might be called reparations, like the subsidy, which I think Culver City is required to do to enable African Americans to move into homes that are now unaffordable to them, but that would have been affordable when they were first built. And it's also going to require policies that will be enormously resisted, like challenges to zoning, which don't cost a penny.
Thank you for that, and that is definitely something we're going to be considering during the general plan. In the interest of time, and Richard's time in particular, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, could you come up here so that you can use this microphone and that everyone in the audience can hear you? Step right up. Don't be intimidated.
And it's actually 7:30, so if you would like to get your books signed, we probably should have Richard sign books.
Okay.
Can you answer questions or sign books? I can't do both.
I know. Can we vote on it?
Let's see if we have any questions really quick. Kate, could you come up here to the microphone?
Hi, I'm Mary Sutton. I've done a lot of work on mass incarceration in Los Angeles and around the country. I just saw a video recently on the housing market, and I understand that the banks are sitting on thousands and thousands and thousands of potential foreclosures. That, they're saying the economy picked up, but they're actually, the statistics are that they stopped foreclosing on people to wait for the right time. Plus, in the banks, they are sitting on foreclosures. It seems to me this is an opportunity to do something like you were talking about in Culver City on a larger scale, is that these foreclosures be given up to the public, and then it could be reparations for all the black families whose wealth was totally extracted, and however many. So I'm just wondering if this is a fact. This video I saw, I don't know a lot about it, but it seems like a great opportune time to create a movement.
Well, foreclosures are disproportionately affecting minority families, mostly because during the build-up to the 2008 economic collapse, African American and Hispanic families were targeted by mortgage originators for subprime loans, which became unsupportable after 2008. So you're right, foreclosures disproportionately affect Black and Hispanic families. They're being forced out of homes that they should not. They should have been eligible for regular loans that white people got, and they were not marketed, those loans. So this is another area that needs to be fixed.
Thank you. Richard will now go sign some books, but if you'd like to ask a question and continue the conversation, just come up to the microphone.
Anybody who has a question for me can send me an email. It's riroth@epi.org, and I'd be glad to answer your questions.
Ellen?
Yes. So I just want to thank everyone for being on the panel today. I have a question about the movement we're talking about, another civil rights movement. What does that entail, and does it fall back on the shoulders of people of color? So, I don't know.
So, since I don't see anybody grabbing their mic really quickly, I'll start. I feel like there are a number of movements afoot right now across the country. We live in such a media stratified era that they don't often actually get the media coverage that they deserve, but for the most part they are being led by people of color and women of color and poor people. There is a group called Take Back the Land in particular that has various chapters around the country where they basically either buy land outright for community land trust, or they occupy city-owned land and negotiate with cities so that it can be transferred to a community land trust, and they keep that land within the community and below market rate, either for home purchase or for the purpose of renting in perpetuity. And it's only owned by people. We have a number of land trusts in Los Angeles County as well, but that's one way that people are already organizing. There's also burgeoning housing justice movement in general. Many of us have probably heard the phrase housing as a human right. It's becoming more popular, and people are becoming more specific with their demands around housing in particular, particularly in California. Of course, there are a lot of people in the Bay Area, Oakland in particular, who are regularly involved in direct actions around basically taking back and squatting in unused houses. Also in Philadelphia, there's this group called the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, who for the last 20 to 30 years have been doing the same thing, occupying unused homes in the Philadelphia area, and to some degree either just staying there or negotiating with the city so that the ownership rights can be transferred to the community.
I'm not in the housing movement. I'm very much at the front lines of the movement in mass incarceration, and so I very much feel that we're already in a civil rights movement that is centering that issue in particular, mass deportation and mass incarceration. And some of the struggles that we have is making sure we have multiracial solidarity in those movements. The stories that we tell matter. I'll be honest, I felt like tonight when I was sitting here, and this is a good thing, it's not a bad thing, that this was white people's business, and it might actually be better for me to leave. That you all were having a really good conversation with each other, and a really important conversation with each other, and it's oftentimes your responsibility to have that conversation with each other and to teach one another and to guide one another, and sometimes it's for us to leave, right? And to give you your space to have that and to work with one another. I think I just want to leave it at that. I think that a very good job was done tonight in terms of white people educating white people. This issue about the term reparations is a kind of a key. That's a code word. I throw that out in an all-black room. It does not cause great alarm. Not at all. So the kind of pushback you heard is about kind of the milieu we have here, which is a beautiful milieu. I'm not disrespecting that at all. But that's sort of the work that we have to do together. We've got to get closer to where these code words mean the same things to one another.
Yeah, and I just want to underline one of the things Kelly mentioned. I think in general when we have difficult conversations where we're in the privileged position, for instance, all of us men having a conversation around gender and gender discrimination, and suddenly, a certain percentage of the men get 10s. But I think it's up to us in those privileged groups to have the conversations ourselves, because, and I think you were probably alluding to this, Ellen, so many times we have asked people who are being oppressed to educate us about their oppression and then also solve it. And I think, well, one, that's completely unfair. But to make any type of substantive change, you need a very large percentage of the populace of the people who are privileged or in a privileged position. John, any thoughts? Okay, do we have any more questions? Here you go, sir.
Good evening. My name is Bill Bolden. I'm a resident of Culver City. And first I want to thank the panel for bringing out these things, which I knew already. But a lot of people didn't know that. I am a product of the South and of the sit-ins of the 60s. I marched. I still have a tear gas scar canister on the bottom of my leg. But when Richard brought up about the starting the revolution again, one thing that's happening right now, this country is so divisive. Everybody knows that now. But what worked back then was one accord. And a lot of white people, what was her name, Viola? The white lady that got killed in Mississippi, was Leuza or something. I remember. But anyway, everybody got involved, and the people from the North came down to the South, and the resident white people of the South didn't really. She was the catalyst. I'm not asking anybody, any of you here, to die for it, but it got everybody's attention when the whole country say, these idiots have killed a white woman. And most of the stuff started over it. And this is a harsh reality. The biggest problem is, and I'm sure you know it, is white men, which are afraid of their own white women. That's why you have the disparity in jobs. You don't get paid the same as the same person doing the same job you do. And that's what's wrong. But until everybody decides to get on one step, when soldiers march, I'm ex-military. If you don't march in step, you're going to just run into one another. It's just a common thing. If we don't come together, it's not going to work. We're just blowing smoke.
Not to push back too much, but there are a lot of different opinions during the what Reverend Lawson calls the Black Freedom Movement, and not everybody was necessarily on the same page. But if you look at the work of social scientist Erica Chenoweth and her book Why Civil Disobedience Works, she posits by doing a quantitative study of movements both within the United States and around the country that you need 5% of the populace to be actively involved to have a successful nonviolent movement. I want to see if there are any other questions. I know there are a lot of planners in the audience, and I'm curious if you have any questions in regards to that. But I see a hand right here. Can you come up here to the mic?
Hello, I'm Jack Galenti, resident of Culver City. I was at Culver High, and there was a race incident, as they put, and it was, I'm gonna get to the question, but the school handled it for people who understood the topic and understood the significance of the incident. The school handled it very badly, and it was seen as a polarized school, the school versus the community that saw it as what it was and not as an issue or something that needs to be resolved. But my question to the people up here, how can the city, and more importantly, the education portion of the city, resolve that as in a grander scheme? Because I saw firsthand how they covered up the issue without viewing it head on.
Yeah, well, I actually think that's the point I was getting at, is that unless we address this stuff head on, we are never going to solve it. And that's why the city has to set an example by admitting what this city has been like. And then it's going to reflect on the schools, and people will, non-whites will feel safer in the city, and all the things can start to get addressed once the truth is out there and being talked about, wrangled about, meetings to get at it. In other words, if it's still hidden. And it sounds like that's what they did at the school. I don't know what incident you're talking about, but if they just try to sweep it under the rug, deal with it administratively, they should be having mass meetings in the auditorium to talk about stuff like that. Here's what happened, here's what's wrong with it, what can we do? The city ought to be doing meetings like that. We need to address this stuff widely and broadly and honestly.
I would tend to agree, and I think as a city so far we've taken the first step. The initial conversation around John's research happened at the Mamie Clayton Library and Museum, and I'm very happy that the city, consented to have this conversation be like a real city-sponsored event. I don't think there are a lot of cities of our size that would actually do that. And I will say I also don't think there are other councils in the past that would have been as open to this conversation. So I want to thank my colleagues and the staff in particular for being open to putting this out in the public. But this is just the start, as John said. We're having part of the conversation. Obviously, it's not the entire conversation. And we need to continue. With that said, do we have any other questions from the audience? I'm surprised you don't have a question, Noah. Nancy?
Okay. Quick question. So, I noticed that a lot of you don't use the word racist or racism, which is fine. But how I feel like a lot of the times is just calling it in the spaces where it is. But I want to hear kind of your recommendations. One of the things that really bothered me recently when Disney Plus came out, I had a lot of friends posting that some of Disney's early films were really racist, and they were now having this really great banner that said, well, these culturally things weren't appropriate then. And it's like, no. Just call it what it is. This was racist because that's what it was. And I feel like a lot of the times we do everything with with gloves. It's like, oh, we have to be careful. It's like, people have different cultural opinions. So I try to do that more, being anti-racist as opposed to just like, oh, we have different opinions. But I want to hear from you. What do you advise? Do you go in there and just call it what it is? Or do we kind of, tiptoe around it? Because I don't feel like that's gotten us very far. But I want to.
Well, I hope you can tell from my presentation that I'm all for telling it like it is. And I don't think there's any other way with this stuff. I mean, especially white people, if we aren't willing to talk about this and admit it, that it happened, and say that we're against it and we want to fight to change it, and that we want to live in harmony and peace with people of all races and colors, if we aren't willing to talk about that and fight for it, then where are we? And maybe I will comment about this whole idea of a new civil rights movement. I mean, I think we need even a bigger movement, more than just civil rights. I mean, this country is in serious doo-doo. And I don't understand why there aren't millions in the streets. I mean, this stuff is really getting bad. You know, the stuff around race is a huge part of that, but it's far from the full picture. The stuff, they're locking immigrants in cages, they're stealing kids from them. I mean, they're doing some of the most horrendous stuff. It's getting, you know, approaching Nazi Germany, and we really need to take it on. I don't understand why we don't have a huge movement fighting this stuff.
Amen.
Any comments, Kelly?
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I mean, of course, what's happening with immigrants is also about race. It's largely about race, if not entirely. I actually use white supremacy as my most common term, and all the policy people I work with don't like that at all. It's, they'd love for me to say racist, really tone it down a bit. But for me, I think white supremacy is much more accurate. It names, you had said, it's white men, right?
Yep.
We could debate that, but yes, absolutely, right? And naming white supremacy gives it a face, gives it a place, more specifically than racism. So I agree with you, and I would up your ante a little bit. Up your ante.
I would also just add, and I see a hand right here, but I thought I saw a hand right here first for a question.
I want to let Culver City residents ask all their questions, because I can't, like, because I'm an outsider, so.
Okay. Thank you for that courtesy. But I would only add also that from a political perspective, I think politicians at every level have been pigeonholed when they talk about race as the Latina, the black person who talks about black stuff, as if you can separate your skin from your experience. But I think we need to be more, as policymakers and as politicians, we need to be more comfortably being fully ourselves in every occasion and talking about the same oppressions and microaggressions and systemic issues that we deal with. But, question?
This is a tricky question, but within the context of, you know, this being part of our general plan update series, and it's a community conversation, it's a challenge for our community right now to try to find creative ways that this actual general plan update will be able to be impactful to solve some of these problems we've discussed. And I'm just curious what specific ideas you think could be a conversation that, you know, we get working on right away.
Well, I mean, from a policy perspective, the small idea, which I think will have, like, you know, a big effect, you know, at the Prelude series, you know, we started having childcare available. And I think there's a huge separator, especially for a small city like ours, in being able to participate in civic life, and let alone being able to run for office. Since it is a part-time position, you have to have a certain type of job. You can't have a 9-to-5. Most people with those higher-paying, more affluent jobs tend to be white people. And then, you know, just from the child care perspective, people can't participate when they have families in general. And in California, the people having the most families are Latinx folks. So when you don't have childcare available, a lot of times you're disproportionately excluding those people from the conversation. But I think as we approach, you know, new housing policies, as we consider changing our zoning policy in particular, I think that's a very substantive way that we can attack this issue. I think a lot of cities around the state are looking at their zoning policy and how, you know, most of the people who actually own houses in most of their cities are white people, and most of the people who either have condos or rent apartments are people of color. So if you have a city whose, you know, basic planning policy prioritizes and holds sacrosanct single-family zoning, then you're also basically discriminating against people of color in a de facto way. So I think we're all, on the council level, open to looking at housing policy, in particular, expanding childcare in general, not just for these prelude meetings, but for committees and commissions, and trying to look at ways that we can do that for all city events, including city council meetings, so that people who have children can actually participate more. But this is a long process, so if you have ideas, there are a number of ways in which you can interface. Other comments?
Yeah, I certainly would recommend taking a sweep of the local municipal code and decriminalizing poverty at every point that you can, certainly when it comes to the local police and what they can enforce against the houseless and homeless population. So that would be one step that Culver City could affirmatively take in terms of reducing, if not ending, the policing of our homeless populations. Because, of course, houselessness and housing are tightly related issues. And we haven't really talked about the homeless population, which is over 30% African American, which is deeply tied to the accumulation of wealth that has happened through the history that you all have talked about. And I would think about the fines and fees as well that might be attached to the criminal justice system here locally. That would be my recommendations coming at it from that perspective.
Yeah, and I would add that, and it's been mentioned at a number of different meetings, but maybe not everyone in this room knows our police department has got a $750,000 grant from LA County to work on diversion programs with the nonprofit New Earth here in Culver City. So hopefully that will make interactions between our police department and young people of color less likely to, have those individuals sent into the carceral system. So that's a potential positive that hopefully we'll see great benefits from in the next few years. All right, okay. I see 3 more questions. Please come to the mic.
So I have a maybe difficult question. Besides the moral dimension of reparations or making amends, however you want to call it, what are the compelling reasons for a comfortable person whose life has not been necessarily affected by these issues? What is the compelling reason for them to get involved?
If they're good people? Well, if you look at studies around integration in schools, segregation in general, you find that there is a benefit for both white and black children and long-term benefits when it comes to affect regulation, critical thinking skills, and things like that. I would assume that something similar would be true for more integrated neighborhood. That is, and I feel like, just from a colloquial level, some of the things that a lot of us love about our favorite cities are the fact that they're so cosmopolitan. And I think, but if you look at the studies around education, segregation, education and integration, there are long-term benefits for children who grow up in a really integrated school versus one that's segregated, even if the segregated school is well-resourced in a white neighborhood.
So Daniel answered that question really well, and I just want to affirm that that's an incredible answer, and that there's just a super ton of neuroscience research backing all of that up, and segregation can be a term used in a lot of different ways, not just about race, not even just about class, but also about ability, and then also about acceleration within a school system, so gifted and talented classrooms versus remedial classrooms, and et cetera. And really, the data shows that segregated classrooms in every single possible way that you define it do not benefit the larger cohort. Even for the gifted and talented kids who are being accelerated, there are a lot of negative things that come out of being segregated because they do not get those critical thinking skills, innovation skills, and global citizenry skills. So, but my question is actually less to the panel, but more because I can't not say it in front of the GPAC committee, because I'm hearing you all talk about childcare for council meetings and all commission meetings and all community meetings city hosted, and I just want to put it out there. We need childcare for our school board meetings, and if the city would put that into their general plan, I think it would go a long way because they're very poorly attended. And we have reasons for them to be very well attended, and even in those moments, they're not. And so I'm just gonna do this right now. So last year we had an incident, speaking of the Culver City High School's racist incident, which I'd love to talk to you about afterwards. But last year we had a blackface incident at an elementary school. And we did talk about it at a school board meeting very briefly because, very justifiably angry parents came in, but there were maximum 20 people there. And so I'm quite certain, because there were hundreds of families affected by that, hundreds of families, and 20 people came to the room. I'm quite certain that if we had childcare, that they would have come in larger numbers and that they need to be there, so I'm just gonna make that ask to GPAC.
All right, since you baited me about not saying anything, here I am. So this is actually a comment. I mean, and I'll just frame it that way because the question was raised. What can the general plan process do? And I guess so. I just wanted to highlight and express my appreciation for the emphasis in a lot of the material from the panelists about the intersection between policing and a whole series of other issues in our community. And so I'm going to just say the thing that I said at every GPAC meeting so far, which is that I think it's a big problem that policing has not been on the agenda. We've been charged with talking about equity, we've been charged with talking about housing, we've been charged with talking about public space, but from the materials that have been given to us, policing have not been on the agenda. And I don't think we can meaningfully talk about housing. I don't think we can meaningfully talk about public space. I don't think we can meaningfully talk about civic participation. I don't think we can meaningfully talk about equity without explicitly talking about our vision for policing in our community. And I hope that the City Council will explicitly inject that into the process because it's not the direction that we've received. It's not the way the process has been set up. And the GPAC has a limited ability to change that because we're in advisory capacity. And I'm not even sure what the view would be on the majority of the GPAC, but I'm going to keep saying it. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Noah.
Hello, my name is Natasha, and I have a question. So to my understanding, a lot of the city general fund goes to the police section, correct? How do us residents affect the city budget, the upcoming annual city budget, so that more of it can be allocated to housing, to education, instead of just policing?
That's a very good question. Our budget work plan meetings and then our actual budget meetings are some of the least attended city council meetings that there are. And I feel like I've mentioned this to people before, if, one, organize, but two, like if you organize a group of people prior to the budgeting happening, maybe you also meet with us city council members to tell you your priorities, but then also just show up when we have our budget meetings and make your case. And I think one really important point is to be explicit. A lot of people come in and I feel like they talk from a moral point of view without, specific suggestions. And I think if you want to make an argument for, changing this part of the police budget and putting it over here, one, tell me where you want to move that money to. Tell me how that's gonna counteract some of the arguments that I feel like our police rightly will have around response times, around readiness, and then tell me how changing that money from here to here is really going to benefit the community. Because I feel like if you can come in and you can say from a moral perspective this is wrong, but if you don't have like a specific policy proposal, then you're just asking us to move a couple $1 million in a sort of vague way, and there's not much that we can really do that's actionable in that way. But I would just say come with a plan, but also just organize other people in the community, and then meet with all of the city council members ahead of time and, explain your reasoning.
With the follow-up question, if I may ask, when are the annual budget meetings for Culver City?
Usually April, right?
We're gonna vote on a tentative calendar, and I think that our work plan sessions will be in early March, March 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. So the work plan is a good time to talk about that.
So work plan meetings in early March, March 2nd, 3rd, and 4th?
I think so.
And then, and that's when, you know, all of the department heads, you know, basically talk about their plan for the year. We have later budget sessions, but that's usually a little bit too late. Like having real input in the work plan process is really where to go. But also meet with us ahead of time and come with a plan. Other questions?
Can I just, real quick, I would say that if you all, city council, can work with the police to get us clean data, we would be happy at $1 Million Hoods to run the numbers for you and really show where the fat is in terms of unnecessary arrests. We can really talk about how many arrests are happening in your local community that do not need to be happening. That's the amount that you can move at minimum, the number of police officers and the infrastructure that's associated with those numbers of arrests. Of course, we'd also talk about racial disparities, geographic disparities, but, well, that's not what my team does, but we can certainly open up a conversation. But I need the clean data. I've gone after Culver City data before. They gave us a completely unusable data set, and that was, I would imagine, done by design. If you all can work with your folks to get good, clean, ready data, we'll run it for you, no cost, okay?
We can talk about that.
I'm Grace. I'm an outsider. I come from. I'm the Natural Resources Chair for League of Women Voters, LA County, and I met Megan and Alex going to regional housing needs assessment meetings because, you know, my portfolio includes air and water pollution, and climate change. And guess what? Housing policy is climate policy. Let's repeat that. The whole room. Housing policy is climate policy. And you know why everyone in LA cares about housing policy, or they should if they were awake? Segregation is really bad for traffic, and everybody here hates traffic. So, that's my caveat. And my question for anyone here is that in the regional housing needs assessment, there is and I want to thank Megan for voting to do what's right for the region instead of what's easy for your city. You know, you guys were a leader in that, and I really appreciate that your electeds were out there. Alone in the West Side compared to Beverly Hills, we just we wish every city had such great electeds. Anyway. So we have a regional housing needs assessment, you have your numbers, and then we have our social equity factors where we're trying to even out, redress past injustices, and add more low-income housing in job-rich neighborhoods where there aren't enough low-income housing. But what levers do government have to, I mean, you can zone, but that doesn't mean they're going to be built. So what levers do you have, and like what are your plans for getting those units built?
That's a good question. I feel like we could answer that in a couple hours. But very, very briefly, we're going to be, well, like you said, we're going to be looking at our zoning in general during the general plan process. But then we're also going to be looking at inclusionary zoning ordinances. We're also, as part of a number of studies that our housing department is doing, we're also doing a survey of public land in Culver City to see if there is any land like the land that the Habitat for Humanity houses are built on. I believe it's Caltrans land. So if there's any other land like that in our city, we're trying to identify it. Culver Palms United Methodist is actually taking the lead, and Lisa Lindgren, who was here earlier, had to leave tonight because they're taking a vote on actually permitting the development of affordable housing on the church's property. So we're looking at ways that we can facilitate the production of more units. We're open to suggestion, but that's what we're looking at right now. I believe, Megan, you're on the housing subcommittee, right? Oh, no. Okay. No housing subcommittee members here tonight. Otherwise, I would pass the mic to have them talk a little bit more explicitly because that's not all we're doing. But we're open to ideas, and we're networking with colleagues in other cities around California and around the country to do as much as we can. But right now, inclusionary zoning to increase the production of affordable units for new developments. But I mean, frankly, and we talked about it before, I think we could have had a whole conversation about it. It's my personal opinion, not the city's opinion, that we really do need to come up with a 21st century version of social housing, like works so well in many other countries around the world, and shake off the stigma of projects, because like Richard said, we can build more units, but if they're all luxury or market rate housing, then we're really not going to help the people who need it the most. We're not even really going to be helping middle class people that much. We will in like 10 or 15 years, but we need to do more. So if you have other suggestions, I'm sure you already have Megan and Alex's contact info. The rest of us are just first name, last name at culvercity.org. Okay, I think that's it, unless we had any final burning question. I want to thank everybody for staying so long, and even though Richard's gone, I want to applaud our entire panel. And be sure to thank our staff for setting up another incredible event.